everyone, and welcome to today's research seminar. My name is Shirin Malikpour. I'm an associate professor at Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and I'll be hosting the seminar today. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are all coming together today. In my case, it's the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I'd also like to welcome those who may be joining us for the first time, including. For those who are new to MSDI's research seminar series, these seminars are really intended to provide different disciplines working on different aspects of sustainable development. The series really aims to create a space for interdisciplinary conversations on some of the challenges we face in creating a sustainable future and the knowledge that is being developed and created by different scholars across the world to address these challenges. So today it is my absolute pleasure to welcome our international speaker from Sweden. Åsa Persson is Research Director and Deputy Director of the Stockholm Environment Institute. Her research focuses on sustainable development, governance, and climate change governance. And she's particularly interested in SDG implementation at the national environmental policy integration, global governance of climate adaptation, and the very famous planetary boundaries. She's a member of the independent group of scientists drafting the next Global Sustainable Development Report for the UN, so a close colleague of mine. And as you know, the Global Sustainable Development Report really evaluates policy recommendations on how to unlock transformations for SDG change. Åsa is also a lead faculty in the Earth Systems Governance Scientific Network. So today she's going to talk about, right as we are halfway through the 2030 agenda, taking stock of SDG research and its policy relevance. So with so many SDG enthusiasts across MSDI and Monash today in the room, the floor is yours, Åsa.
Thank you so much, Shirin, and thank you everyone for joining this seminar. First, let me check that you hear me well. I hope my connection is going to work well. Yeah, it's a pleasure to join you from Stockholm early morning. I selected quite a big title for this talk. I'm not going to take stock of of the nearly, I believe, 20,000 research articles on SDGs that have been produced, of course. But I wanted to give you a bit of a smorgasbord, to use the Swedish term, of research. And I think it's time for the scientific community to also think about this halfway milestone and how we can produce policy relevant science. So let me share my slides with you. And I hope to talk for around 30 minutes or so, maybe 35 at most, and then have some time for questions and comments, of course. And let me also say, I've been working quite a lot with Australian colleagues earlier in my career, and it's been a pleasure to work with Shirin and Cameron as part of the GSDR. And I hope we can also find more collaboration opportunities between your institute and our institute, the Stockholm Environment Institute. Good. Can you also see the slide? Yes, perfect. Yeah, so as mentioned, I think the halfway point is a big sort of policy milestone. We do expect this kind of narrative now leading up to the SDG summit in September, that how do we move from here? We know we're not in a good situation with the SDGs. But as I mentioned, I think it's also a moment for science to do some self-reflection We, as IGS members, we have been out talking about the report now, conveying our recommendations for policy, talking to business, etc. But I felt this seminar is a good opportunity to start also talking to science colleagues what this means. So in this talk, I'll give you not the full GSDR presentation, because I hope that Shirin and Cameron will share that with you and give their take on it and the underlying work. But a very quick sort of trailer, as it were, as a backdrop. And then look a little bit, start unpacking a little bit the SDG research to date. What have we achieved? And then share with you a few examples of recent SEI research on SDGs. And then the last part is to start brainstorming a little bit, speculating what could be new research avenues for the second half of the SDGs. Right, so this is basically the report outline. We have been, of course, considering many keywords. What are the key messages? One of the recurring ones have been, in my view, that transformation is possible and it's inevitable. So we already know very well that transformation is needed. So now it's rather to convince decision makers that we have transformed societies in the past. It is possible, but also that change is inevitable, as we have seen with the pandemic and the various crises hitting energy security, food security, cost of living recently. So SDG progress is going to be critical to build resilience to future crises. So the first chapter looks at the progress to date, and then we start looking at the future, where are we heading, but also highlighting there not just the sort of scenario projections, but also the agency that we have, because the future is not given. So what kind of SDG action has been taken to date, and what kind of SDG knowledge has been produced. We then go into the big question for policymakers, what needs to be done. And here, particularly Shirin and Cameron have really contributed a lot, looking at key shifts and interventions, providing that sort of list of key changes to policymakers that they are requesting. But we also, the group felt that we wanted to take a more dynamic perspective on transformation. So we talk also about transformation as a process. I'm sure this is literature and research that is very familiar to you and you have contributed to. And then we have a chapter on science policy interface, and of course end with a call to action. And we hope to produce or publish 2 background papers, also literature reviews that have informed the GSDR. So this is the current scoreboard that we have. That will be a key diagram of the report. It will be updated a bit with the latest data. But we don't have time to go into detail there. I think the key message is to just take note that it's not very green, as in we are making good progress, trends are going in the right direction, we are close to target, but as you can see, it's very red, orange, and some yellow. So of course, a few positive trends. Renewables expansion has moved. Some aspects of gender equality are moving in the right direction. But really, when looking at these particular indicators, and these are selected indicators of the SDGs, we do see sort of slowing down or even reversal of progress, of course, much due to the pandemic. As you can see, for SDGs 14 and 15, 13, there is particularly a lack of progress on those more environment-related goals. But it's still early to say if these effects of the pandemic were temporary shocks, if we are going to still recover, or whether there are more permanent scarring effects. We do see a worrying growing gap between high and low income countries. And as I mentioned earlier, we do, of course, discuss these crises that have occurred since 2019, when the previous GSDR was launched. and we have to expect future crises. So where are we heading then? So that's where we are now. Where are we heading? And we do review the scenario literature in the report. And of course, with business as usual pathways, we won't achieve the SDGs by 2030 or even 2050. If we look at the more sustainability pathways, with more ambitious actions, there are still gaps in SDG attainment. And this is something, of course, we need to communicate honestly to policymakers that we're probably not sort of, even if we took very ambitious action, we are not guaranteed in any way to achieve the SDGs. So I think it's more about conveying that narrative of every inch of progress matters, similar to what the IPCC has done for the 1.5 degree target. But altogether, of course, it's very clear that transformation and game-changing interventions are needed. That particular word, game-changing interventions, is something that has come up again and again from the policymakers and the diplomats that the group of scientists have been interacting with. And it's, of course, challenging for scientists to identify such game-changing interventions for such a broad set of goals. But in this pathways chapter, we do reuse the framework from the 2019 GSDR, which had identified 6 entry points for transformation and 4 categories of levers. So ending up with this matrix structure, we added capacity building as a lever. And we do, based on actually scenario literature, because sort of the question was, where do you start identifying the key shifts or game-changing interventions, if you like. We looked at global scenario literature, but of course you can adopt other approaches. So that would be also very interesting to discuss further with you. I'm not going to show the list of key solutions because, I mean, partly it's a lot of material, but also they will be very familiar to you because, of course, multiple reforms are needed, reforms that are known very well, carbon pricing, universal social insurance, etc. So there are few kind of magical, easy fixes for the SDGs, unsurprisingly. The next chapter looked at transformation as a process, adopting that more dynamic view, and here I hope that Shereen and Cameron will give you a more detailed, insightful talk, because this is a very rich chapter. But we talk about basically what levers can be used at these different stages of a change process and what kind of impediments can be anticipated and therefore managed in a good way. The calls to action. There are quite a lot of words on this slide, and I feel it does not really make justice to the actual calls to action. I hope you will take a moment to read them in September when the report is out. But of course, we do recognize this need for concerted effort at halfway point, whether it's an SDG transformation framework or something similar. We had a similar approach for the MDGs, where countries, and then we were talking mainly about developing countries, produced a sort of acceleration framework and prioritized certain goals. Funders prioritized those goals, and there was a focus on the sort of bottlenecks to achieve those selected goals and targets. Maybe something similar is needed now, but of course we also don't want to lose the holistic perspective that the SDGs offers, and how can we still consider SDG interlinkages, for example, even if we prioritize more. Okay, I will leave the GSDR at this point. I hope that gave you a teaser of what it is. But then, as I mentioned, I sort of turn back to SDG research and science. And so what has been achieved the last 7 years? So I had a look at some bibliometric analysis, and also we do raise this in the GSDR. it is quite astonishing to see the rapidly growing interest in the SDGs since 2015. So as you can see, that curve is fairly steep, and a lot of articles, as mentioned, are being produced. And you also see a map there of which parts of the world produce a lot of research. Australia is one of these countries. Sweden is also fairly active. And the word cloud, I think, is based on some 12,000 SDG articles, showing you a little bit the focus. And there are a lot of general words in there, but health do pop out. And actually, looking at the literature, it's clear that there was a very strong health focus, especially in the beginning of the SDGs back in 2015. One study there to the left looked at a smaller sample, 300 plus review articles, sort of suggesting that these types of reviews are important to obviously synthesize knowledge and can really help us move forward in providing sort of synthesized evidence. And here we can see that in 2015, the bar is completely green, and that's SDG 3, the health SDG, and that continues to be quite dominating. But now, the last year is 2022, there is more diversity. But I would say also from my personal perspective, that's still fairly little synthesis of some SDGs. For example, SDG 10 on inequality and SDG 16 on governance, which we, I think, have good reason to believe that they are critical to SDG attainment. And the other diagram there shows also which are the top SDGs in this body of work. So there is uneven coverage of individual SDGs. We can discuss what does this mean. Should we try to intentionally fill those gaps? What's more interesting perhaps is not just to look at which SDGs are covered or not, but really what is the purpose of research. And here I use Cameron Allen's and colleagues' paper from 2021, which very usefully identifies 4 priorities for science. And this is what, based on a review of scientific papers, I guess both what they say about which type of research is needed, but the team also sort of found these categories in the literature, so it's also empirically based. But 4 big sort of purposes here: monitoring and evaluation, evaluating progress on the SDGs, data monitoring frameworks, etc. The second one there is on assessing and managing interlinkages between SDGs. The third one is taking that transformation perspective. What pathways are possible and sort of effective. And fourthly, more specific focus on SDGs and planetary boundary framework. Are they consistent? And what I'm trying to, the question I'm asking here to us is also, at this point, halfway point, do we need other, other types of research, other additional purposes that we should be considering more? What if we turn to uptake of all this SDG research and knowledge? Is this science used? Is it useful? And again, in this paper by Cameron and colleagues, they looked at more than 50 voluntary national reviews, the reports that countries submit to the UN to report their progress on SDGs, and looked at did they make use of these science-based tools and frameworks in these 4 categories. And as we can see from this figure, it seems that no, there's still a gap in using this type of science-based tools and frameworks. We see more use of the monitoring frameworks, but less when it comes to assessing interlinkages adopting this transformation or pathways approaches, modeling pathways, and also very little on connecting SDGs with the planetary boundaries. We can speculate, why is this? Is it because policymakers don't have access to science, or that we produce science that is inaccessible to this audience? Do we not have aligned incentives? Why do we produce science? Is it for our peers and for our scientific impact, or is it to be used? Or is there actually a kind of demand-supply mismatch that the policymakers need other types of knowledge than we are currently producing? Question mark. So with that backdrop, I wanted to give you a few examples of SDI research. So our institute was quite active in the development of the SDGs, interacting with the negotiators back in 2014. And so we have followed this agenda with great interest. We do find it useful because, like your institute, we are, sustainable development is very central to our mission. But as I'm sure you also feel sometimes, you can, of course, work with sustainable development without explicitly connecting with the SDG framework per se. It's only one manifestation of sustainable development, of course. But I'll try and raise kind of three broad research streams. One is quite a classic one, I guess, trying to assess the impact on the SDGs from taking policy action or different policy options. In this case, impact on SDGs from climate policy, and in particular NDCs, the climate plans that countries submit to under the Paris Agreement. And our team, so here, one of our core sort of tools that we provide to decision makers is the LEAP tool. Is an energy analysis and planning tool that has been used, I think, for some 30 or 40 NDCs. And they have over time, with the help of the SDGs, expanded it to consider more sort of co-benefits or impact on SDGs, like health, labor productivity, etc. And it's been very useful for them to identify and quantify those co-benefits and provide these more sort of comprehensive and compelling arguments for taking action. So on this slide here, I show you one comparison they did of various science-based tools and models. I'm sure you're familiar with some of them, on what they actually do. And the other example there, the report is a recent one where they apply this tool. If you are interested, it was an integrated assessment of air pollution and climate change for the Africa region. So what I hear from this team is, because these are sort of traditional modelers, you could say, is that still there is very strong, consistent demand for these quantified evidence of, what are the positive health impacts that can help persuade ministries of finance to invest more in climate policy, for example. That's what the climate policy makers need and want in the countries. So that seems to be a sort of stable demand, as it were. Okay, moving on to another area of research, which is SDG interlinkages. So this was featured also in that Cameron and colleagues framework of priorities for science. And this has really also grown very rapidly, this stream of research. And we were thinking about this fairly early on. Our director co-developed this, Måns Nilsson co-developed this very simple scale of trying to assess whether one goal or target is synergistic or enabling, reinforcing, indivisible for reaching other goals, or whether it has this negative effect, whether it presents trade-offs in the sense that it's constraining, counteracting, or even cancelling out the achievement of other goals. And we started also contributing to this literature of kaleidoscope sustainability factors, these very colorful matrices of cross-impact matrices of SDG impacts. We developed this science into a very practical tool called SDG Synergies, which is participatory. So it's not a sort of expert, not a modeling tool in that sense, where the team has produced a lot of assumptions about these interlinkages. But really what it does is that it's ask the participants, who can be, let's say, policymakers from local or national governments, maybe other stakeholders, to themselves sort of design the scope of the study, select which targets to focus on, and then do this interaction scoring using the scale. And then the software allows you to produce these cross-impact matrices and also network analysis. So this has been applied at different levels. And we also have a sister tool, which is more geared towards business. But what can we learn from this tool? And I thought this was more interesting to look at together with you. And this is a recent paper where members of this team took a critical look at how they had applied this tool in 3 countries, and what were the sort of challenges as part of that process. I think overall it was the stakeholders were pleased, and the process itself provided many benefits, bringing people together, introducing this mindset of considering interlinkages and more having more of a system approach to policy making, and that classic sort of outcome when the process is as important or more important than the actual result. But also some interesting challenges they pointed to. I've listed some here. For example, of course, policymakers, unsurprisingly, have typically short time frames, so this will affect how they identify and score synergies and trade-offs. There was a frustration that it's hard to do this at national level without recognizing the heterogeneity and the local variations and local context. The point here of this tool is to have that actor ownership. So actually can be done independently of scientific experts, but there is also sometimes challenges, and of course the selection of targets can be very political. Yes, representation, of course, who is in the room for this exercise is completely determines the results. But an interesting finding was that sometimes when some interests or perspectives or some sectors, for example, were not there and represented, it led to other actors kind of almost role-playing or trying hard to adopt their perspective, which is also, I think, quite a useful outcome. But what is really interesting is that they found that participants do quite often display confirmation bias. So there is a tendency to have a more positive view of your own sector or sort of the target that you represent or work with on a more daily basis, that it would have positive effects on other SDGs. Of course, there can also be participation bias, for example, hierarchies among participants. So it's not a magical tool in any way, but I think interesting to also do this sort of evaluation and see how it actually works in practice. Okay, a final word on this research stream on SDG interlinkages. We tried to, for the GSDR, we did one of those background papers I mentioned is on reviewing the key literature looking at global and general SDG interlinkages. So not necessarily looking at sort of local studies of interlinkages in a particular country or a city level, but these sort of more global studies looking at general patterns. And here you see one result of that work. This is just the number of studies, so it's a very, of course, a crude measure, but we can see that more studies tend to identify synergies for targets relating to health, relating to energy access, relating to poverty reduction. We see more trade-offs typically identified when it comes to the more environment-related SDGs. And also when we look at the direction of impact, we see that SDGs 14 and 15 are typically the most negatively affected by progress in other areas. But of course, this sort of global general patterns have very limited value or applicability, and it's very clear that we need to be context specific at a geographical level, but also sort of considering more the time dimension of how these synergies and trade-offs play out, rather than just a sort of snapshot assessment at a particular point in time. We produce some recommendations based on this literature review, that these types of studies do provide one good starting point for further discussion of which are priority SDGs, or which have provide many synergies, and which are the more problematic SDGs that can raise negative impacts on others. Something I think is a bit underused and under-researched is how this sort of analysis and perspective is institutionalized in policymaking. So we avoid doing these ad hoc studies at one moment in time that may or may not be used in policy processes going forward, but rather look at what are those core policymaking processes, whether it's a regulatory impact assessment, for example, where you can make use of this type of science. When we try to look for this, I think it's really only the EU where we found evidence that the SDGs are explicitly mentioned in the guidance to conduct impact assessment of proposed policy and legislation. Okay, I'm moving on here. The third and final research stream at SEI I wanted to mention is taking a more, let's say, social scientific or governance perspective on policy coherence, which is of course related to understanding SDG interlinkages. Policy coherence is recognized both as a target under the SDGs, target in itself, but also a means to achieve broader SDG progress, that we don't undermine good SDG actions with counteractive policy actions taken in another part of the government. So we have an international project with partners in many countries that looks at this issue of policy coherence, particularly focusing on climate policy and inequality in the context of the broader SDG framework. We undertake 9 comparative country studies. Actually, Australia is included. It's led by colleagues at the University of Canberra. What we really try to demonstrate is that policy coherence is often portrayed as a more technical issue and something that civil servants can work with, and there are methodological frameworks, etc. But in our what we see is that it's really a political process of prioritizing certain goals and targets over others, and prioritizing policy actions accordingly. So I show you on this slide some findings from a recent literature review. This is forming the basis of these country case studies that are now in full swing. where we particularly looked at the relationship between policy coherence, effective outcomes of policies, and inequality. And well, what was least surprising perhaps is that coherent policymaking seems to produce effective outcomes. So that's I guess a positive result in that, yes, it makes sense to strive for policy coherence, but it's not at all clear or very limited evidence that coherent policymaking would by default reduce inequality. And also that effective policies did not really reduce inequality as measured in this study. So if this is of interest to you, I recommend, of course, you to look at the full study, which was just published. But I think what it's telling us is that we need to expand a little bit this notion of policy coherence and maybe start looking more at, you know, how can governments or other organizations work more with sort of conflict resolution between different goals, and also paying more attention to SDG 10 and inequality, and understanding the distributional impacts of striving for other SDGs and pursuing policy actions. So this is of course related to the whole just transition narrative. So those were a few examples of SDG related research. Looking at time, it flies. So this is the last part of my presentation. I just wanted to share some ideas for sort of new research avenues. Now moving into the second half of Agenda 2030. Of course, I think not just sort of thinking new, what are the new research questions? I think it's very important to also address these questions. How can we close this gap between science and policy, make existing science more usable and accessible? So that should also be, of course, an important focus. But also thinking about these new questions for science. I think an interesting suggestion was made in this short commentary by Prajal Pradhan at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact, who states that we should have these three priorities going forward. One is to support the prioritization of SDGs, that we need to as mentioned, so be more focused, support actors in achieving SDGs where they are most lagging behind or where there are important bottlenecks. Science could better demonstrate, quantify, measure, discuss the effects of underachieving SDGs. What is at stake? Of course, this is a pertinent question for the SDG Summit, trying to drum up that new concerted effort. And finally, starting to think about the post-2030 agenda. I wanted to finish off by identifying three possible broad avenues or sort of types of questions. Let me go through them very quickly. But I think one is just to encourage more evaluation research. And I know some work I think is being done at your institute on social system evidence, doing more systematic evidence review for the SDGs. I think this is very valuable. It's challenging, I imagine, but valuable, because this is still a big question. That's what works. You know, if we're lucky, we could identify game-changing interventions, but maybe also if we could identify just effective interventions, that would also come a long way. And I think it's not just about trying to evaluate and compare the ultimate effect of alternative interventions to reach a goal, but also how were impediments overcome along the way. I think that type of evidence is also useful to decision makers faced with tough decisions. So here, of course, the scientific community could invest more in this type of research and also raise the status, perhaps. My second point here is to maybe think more about how to emphasize the time dimension. I feel we have the global community has been very good at using the SDG icons and mapping out for an organization, which SDGs do we cover or address somehow. And it sort of produces these static snapshots. But we don't really perhaps get good answers to the questions of, is this particular action or the development path, is it sustainable over time? So that very basic definition of sustainable development that we started out with. Also other questions, how do synergies and trade-offs play out over time? Can something that is a trade-off sort of over time become more of a synergy or vice versa? How are goals prioritized over time? I think that was very clear in the pandemic when we had many calls for green recovery packages, but at the end of the day, many countries prioritize sort of immediate economic relief rather than sort of using these fiscal measures for green transition. Another point here is I feel at large the SDG planning, but also SDG research could set more concrete timelines, timetables. We don't really see this, I think, in the national reports on SDGs. The figures on this slide is from a report we wrote for the Stockholm +50 conference, where we just reviewed the literature. How long does change take on some different questions, and just mapping out these timescales is quite thought-provoking or inspiring. When what decisions do we need to make now, and what will be their legacy for a long period of time, and also understanding the lead time of making change, developing new legislation, and how to ensure it's still democratically robust. A final point there is on sequencing of action and interventions, and this is to some extent discussed in the GSDR report, but this is, I think, an interesting direction now of that we already see more in scientific research. Here's an example of how climate policy has tended to move through phases with a view to reducing the cost of more low carbon alternatives and technologies, but also building up these coalitions of political support that are needed to actually introduce more ambitious policy. Here is another example from a report on food and land use transformation, where they also, as you can see at the bottom there, suggest when different types of policy levers are particularly useful in order to increase the adoption of more healthy diets, as it were, and how they can contribute to trigger positive tipping points and feedback loops, and also anticipate impediments. The final one is the maybe the most abstract one or less developed one, but my feeling is that we are quite still implicit about our theory of change for the SDGs. There's quite a broad sort of diversity of views on this. What assumptions do we make about change? Who can make transformation happen and how? And this table here is an initial sketch, but I think we have quite different kind of very different world views or frames or logics of appropriateness or discourses. One being a more sustainability transformation, which is quite strong in some parts of the scientific community, and the other one is the more kind of realpolitik. How does conventional politics work? The big question is, of course, can these sort of worldviews somehow? Is there a middle road here? Can we have these sort of long-term science-based goals still inform policy, but maybe adapting to the logic in conventional politics, where there is a need to produce these shorter-term wins for politicians to present to their constituencies. And we really need to connect to core decision-making process in government, the budget negotiations, in order to really have impact. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this more, but of course, very interested in any feedback you may have. So sorry for taking a bit more time, but I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to any comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Åsa. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. It was a very rich and interesting talk. Maybe if you can actually stop sharing the screen, we can quickly jump into the Q&A. So for everyone in the room, please feel free to raise your hands or pop your questions in the chat. It's always better if you just raise your hands and ask your questions directly. I already see a hand up, so I won't ask my question first. I go directly to our colleague, Peter Bragg, online. Peter.
Hi, Åsa. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And thank you for mentioning social systems evidence. I just wanted to point out, and I'll share a link, that we've been involved in building that database since 2019, and we've helped to grow it from about 2,000 articles to, I think at last count, 5,500. So there's certainly a lot of evidence that's available, and the systematic reviews on that are pre-appraised, and they're freely accessible. So I really want to thank you for mentioning that. But I just want to ask you a question, because we've done some reviews in sustainability and health, and one of the observations, even from the few reviews that are in that transforming health system sustainability, have commented that there is a lot more literature on describing the problem and editorializing about the problem than empirical studies about what works to address the problem. And I wonder if you could comment on whether that is also the case in other SDGs, because I was interested in your comment about people just whacking the SDGs up on a website and saying this is really important, because I think that's a huge challenge for science, is to move away from the talking about the problem to actually studying how to address it. So I wonder if you can comment on that across other areas of the SDGs. Thanks a lot.
Do you want me to respond directly?
Yes, please, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I really enjoyed, exploring that database. I hope you will continue to develop it. Yeah, I think what I see is also this sort of, there seems to be a mismatch sometimes with so when these solutions or policies are evaluated and studies are produced, they are often, of course, at quite a high resolution level or detailed. It's a particular design of a particular interventions, which is very hard, I think, to make useful to the negotiators in New York, the SDG people. So, and also I don't think it's very useful either to produce these very high level, transformation pathways that you just, wonder like, where do I start? So somehow connecting these two levels or finding a mid-level of, let's say, resolution in what are the actual solutions. And you asked about other areas, because I can imagine, of course, that there's more evidence in health, because this kind of systematic evidence review is more common maybe in health. In carbon pricing, there are surprisingly few evaluations looking, cross-country studies of these types of mechanisms. So I think that really sparked my interest in trying to see how we can design and conduct more evaluation studies at an appropriate level of detail. Thank you.
Also on that, I might just ask my question also here, which was really when you were commenting on the SDG research and its uptake in policy. In my head, I was also thinking that, is there any difference between what we call the SDG research and research and science in general? Because also really thinking about the SDGs, they're covering all types of topics, right? From poverty, hunger, health, education, climate change, etc., etc. So pretty much we see all types of science also in there playing out. Is there any, in your observation and in your work, is there actually any difference between what we see in the uptake of SDG research, as we call it SDGs, or science in general?
I think that's also a really good question. It's something I've been thinking about trying to capture in this, illustration of sort of different worldviews or archetypes, because I feel that sometimes we are very like SDG minded, whereas in the real world, I mean, we certainly there's more political capital, more attention to what I would say like sectoral policies, climate policy, of course. Comparing the level of attention to climate COP to the SDG high-level political forums taking place each year is, very, very different. So I think, it's a good one to think more about, but I think it's very important not to lose sight of the actual end outcomes of the SDGs, that we don't let these sort of SDG goals, targets, icons blur our vision of actually achieving the outcomes that they prescribe. And I was looking back now at this one paper on transformation pathways prepared by Jeff Sachs and colleagues in 2019, where they also had 6 big transformations similar to the previous GSDR. But they, in their sort of table, when defining these 6 transformations, they actually started out with identifying which line ministries would we talk to about these transformations. Is it energy and transport? Is it health, etc.? And I think that's quite an important starting point if you want to contribute to policy change and uptake of scientific evidence. That we have this understanding of who are we trying to explain our science to, who are we talking to. But yeah, it's a great question, requires some more thought through answer.
Thanks, I appreciate that also. And Cameron, you had your hand up first, I guess. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Shirin, and thanks very much, Åsa. It was a great presentation. I'm really looking forward to reading some of the papers that you put up there. I've copied down on my reading list. Yeah, I mean, I was really interested in that last slide and sort of this mismatch between sort of, I guess, the science community that talks about the need for transformation, and it's very central to the SDGs, I guess, and the practicalities of policy making and the political processes and mechanisms they use. And I was just wondering if what experience you'd had in Sweden with the SDGs, if there'd been much interest from government, and if so, how were they using them, and if they'd called on the research community there to discuss the SDGs. Be interested to hear your experience.
Yeah, so it's quite paradoxical, perhaps. So Sweden is one of those countries that typically score, very high on the SDG index, with a reservation that would be for the sort of, what do we say, territorial or domestic achievement of SDGs. Of course, if we consider international spillovers and consumption footprints, it's a different story. But yeah, if you see Sweden and the other Scandinavian countries as typically very sustainable, no, the SDGs have not really had. They don't have a lot of political weight in Sweden. They don't have a central place in policy making. We do have a SDG coordinator. There are some processes, but they are very marginal, I would say. And now they're actually defunding those types of functions. And I think that sort of, in a way, addresses the question Shirin had also, that you don't necessarily need an SDG label to have, good outcomes on the SDG goals, I think. And another point, and this I think became quite clear when we were working on the GSDR and looking at what are these, really important interventions and shifts, and especially for the more socially oriented goals, it's very much building up a sort of welfare state that will help you achieve many SDGs. And of course, that has been happening in a country like Sweden for a very long time. So it's a little bit awkward, perhaps, to suddenly have this set of SDGs to sort of, define that approach. So in a shorter way, this insight that has already been communicated in a lot of SDG research, the importance of grounding the SDGs in national or regional or local level priorities, not just imposing SDG language prima facie, but trying to step back a little bit and look at the for example, the EU, they use the Green Deal framework because that makes sense for them. That's how they built their sort of political support and approach. So we should look at, will the Green Deal lead to SDG outcomes rather than trying to perhaps look for the SDG labeled initiatives. Thanks.
Thanks, Åsa. Marco and Rob, can I ask you to please maybe both ask your questions, and then Åsa can have one go at answering so that we don't go too much over time. Marco, please go ahead first.
Lower the hand. Oh, great presentation. Thank you so much. I have probably more a suggestion that would be very interesting to explore, because there is a selection bias in picking the topic of SDGs with academics, because academics tend to be on top of what is the most important latest topic or research. It would be nice to compare these and analyze also dimension SDGs into political speech or on social media in general. This is something that can be done with text analysis. You take like a political speech from different politicians across the world, and then you do the same analysis on Google and Facebook, and you can compare the three. Say like, okay, what is the gap? So, like there's a massive mention of SDGs, and then we go on social media and SDGs on climate problems are not really well mentioned. And then you go to the politicians and they don't talk about this at all. I think that would add a lot of value to this topic, to the research in general, because it will help you understand where do we stand as a society compared to where do we stand as academics. Just like, what do you think about that? And this is something that can be done.
Thanks, Marco. And Rob, please go ahead as well.
Thanks, Shirin, and great presentation and great to listen into. I was thinking, listening to your presentations, why are we not achieving the SDGs? It's such a great agenda, and some of the things that I came across previously is that I think it's still very much perceived in general as a environmental and a development agenda, just simply because of the connotations it comes from, and not all decision makers or policymakers identify with that agenda, which I think leads to policy inaction or insufficient policy action. I think that's at least I think that's a key explanation to that. And I wonder if that's adding to your research agenda, whether we should look into sort of what kind of framings or rhetorics actually do work that enables policymakers that maybe do not have this environmental or development identity to engage with that. And some examples, like something like circular economy, people told me that because it has economy in it, really speaks to a different kind of policymaker. But also things like challenge-led missions has attracted a lot of attention. globally. You know, this it has this sort of heroic rhetoric of putting a man on the moon, so it might also be appealing to policymakers. So I wonder if that's what your reflections are in relation to that observation.
Oh, hello, we have.
So go ahead. Sorry, she just came back from childcare and she's screaming because I haven't given her a hug. So sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you both. Extremely good questions. I wish we had more time for discussions over coffee. For the suggestion to listen in more to how the SDGs are talked about essentially in different communities, academic, but also politicians and other, very good. We do a little bit look at sort of broad awareness of SDGs in the GSDR, for example, the number of Google searches, things like that. And I think what we generally find is that there is actually quite broad awareness among also the general public. I think compared with previous UN agendas in particular. But as you sort of implied, also there's another recent book by University of Utrecht colleagues, the political impact of the SDGs, and the main conclusion there is that the SDGs seem to have had mainly discursive impact. So yeah, people talk about them, it's a common language, but it's much harder to trace that to actual actions or institutional mechanisms. But yeah, I think that's a very good suggestion to sort of use these different methodologies to try and understand better the narratives and discourse on SDGs. But that also comes back to the criteria for success. Maybe because of course now we're faced with these very dramatic questions. Are we, do we need to rescue the SDGs? Are we looking at a failure? And then I think this discussion of what are reasonable expectations on an agenda like this is very important. The second question, what sort of framings can raise the interest and sort of activate and mobilize politicians? I think it's a really good one. I agree with you that it's probably seen more as an environment and development agenda, more as a kind of nice to have, rather than, like this is what I want to deliver to my constituents if you're a politician, which might be more, focused on jobs and growth, more the economic agenda. But just one note there, I think it's also some researchers are also observing or sort of wondering whether the SDGs have also had a kind of negative effect on crowding out environment-related goals. Because we did see that pattern that still we see these, least progress and a lot of trade-offs with the environmental related goals. So that sort of very basic trade-off between economy and environment is still there. It hasn't been cancelled out in any way through the SDG framework. And maybe do the SDGs sort of divert attention from the actual environmental goals, or that the sort of biosphere as a foundation for the economy and society. I'm sure you've seen the wedding cake illustration too. But coming back to, what kind of framings or can trigger more attention and help us make more progress? I think in the work of SCI, if you start looking at these economic benefits, that is very compelling. As I mentioned, the study we did on air pollution and climate change, because we're talking about health benefits or labor productivity, then you have the ears of finance ministers, for example. One other policy focus, particularly in Europe, might be industrial policy, and so green industrial policy, which is very big on the agenda here, and also now in the US, Inflation Reduction Act. This sort of how can we build a strong economy, and almost sneaking in the climate and environmental goals as part of that process. It's not labeled, of course, the Clean Energy Act, the US, it's the Inflation Reduction Act, or it's about creating manufacturing jobs, etc. I'm not saying that green industrial policy is always good, and you know, science should also look at the, well, problematize this and is that a sustainable path? But I do, in terms of triggering interest, I think you're right. Like the economic case for the SDGs is probably the least developed compared with environmental and social. I'll stop there. I could talk forever.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate that some people just stayed online despite being past 5 o'clock now. Really appreciate it, and thank you so much, Åsa. It was a really interesting talk and a very interesting topic, and I'm sure we'll just continue this conversation. And I thank everyone who have joined today's seminar as well, and have a great evening, everyone.